Welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Delighted on this episode to be talking with author, creator Luke Piotrowski. Luke, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to have an opportunity to talk about Ferocious, among other things. But yeah,
Yeah,
it's my first comic book, so I'm used to the movie world and being able to talk about this whole new medium. This is one of the first. I think I've done one other interview, but this is one of my first real stops on doing promotion for it, and I could not be happier.
thank you so much for stopping by. I was going to ask about that movement from writing for the screen because I know you've worked in the worlds of Clive Barker and Hellraiser and things of that nature. And so curious what it was like to move from that world to writing for comics and writing Ferocious.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, it wasn't that hard of a transition. It's kind of funny, I talked to my editor Ryan Carroll and Mike Martz at Mad Cave, and I guess they've had other screenwriters come into the world of comics, and sometimes it's not an easy transition, I guess. They think they have writers that are probably trying to not understanding the medium and like trying to have you can't have movement in the panel, guys. Like you have
Right.
to write it this different way. But for me, I've kind of came to comics a little bit late. My family couldn't afford to, and didn't have the time or money to like keep up with, a month to month serialized thing. Be like at the grocery store, can I grab one issue? But that was it. It wasn't until like I was in my 20s and I had income of my own that I'd be like, oh yeah, I could catch up on all this stuff. But it really was, in college when I was being shaped as a writer, I was, reading a lot of comic books and Swamp Thing and Sandman and Grant Morrison's New X-Men and Why the Last Man. Like all these things are really formative and helped shape, I think, my writing as a screenwriter. So when it was time for me to actually finally get in there and play with the tools of the comic book medium, I'd kind of been waiting for that, and it was an easy transition because I think a lot of that medium shaped the way that I looked at screenwriting. So it wasn't tricky, and in fact, it was a lot of fun because I do find that all writing is a game of telephone, right? You come up with an idea, and then you have to communicate that into some other medium, and what's in your head is not the exact message that you eventually end up with that other people see. And when you're working on movies, that game of telephone is so long because you're passing on what you have to do to a co-writer potentially, or just to the page, and then you've got to deal with producers, and then you've got to deal with directors, and then actors, and then production. And so by the time what comes out the other end is like, well, that's 65%, 70% of what I tried to say. Whereas with comics, it's so much more collapsed and it's just me and the artist, with an editor sometimes being like, hey, you guys okay? But it's a much more collapsed game of telephone, which is so satisfying.
Yeah, yeah. The collaborative space, right? The close collaborative space.
And a collaborative space with another artist, in this case a literal artist, but just it's not about we can't afford to do this, we can afford to do whatever we want on the comic book page for the most part, outside of
Hmm.
having a dozen characters. But it is, any compromises or any sort of um collaboration, it's coming from a place of, my artist on this one, Emanuele Ercolani, is it's his name on the book too. It's our story together. And so you are working with somebody who's motivated by their own artistry. And that's inspiring, and it's never about, how many screens, can we get this on? How many jump scares can we cram in? Because we have a formula, we
Hmm.
have there's a lot more freedom, and it feels a lot more artistically motivated. That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm curious about what horror opens up for you. Curious about that attraction to the genre and what it sort of affords for you as a storyteller.
That's interesting. Yeah, I grew up in the 80s. So for me, horror at the time, I was thinking about that a little bit. Today we have so many tentpole movies, this is the era like the nerds have kind of taken over pop culture. And in the 80s
Hmm.
that was starting, But not every movie had, a genre element and was fantastic. And I was a monster kid and I liked genre stuff and fantasy stuff. And back then the lines were very blurred. Gremlins was the first movie I remember seeing in the movie theater. And even movies like Nightmare on Elm Street, like there's this element of like fantasy and like characters banding together to battle evil, and that it has this sort of, larger than life thing, and that always attracted me in a world where we didn't have, the Marvel universe. We kind of had to look at movies like The Gate, where, it's just like, who is this movie even for? Um, it seems like it's for kids, but it's really gnarly at certain points. And so I just grew up with that, and that I think that's always been the attraction. And I studied literature. I was a high school teacher for 9 years, so I'd sort of trained to kind of analyze and look at things in a literary sense. But the things that I love, are these sort of scary things. And I think, certainly working as a horror screenwriter, applying that sort of academic knowledge of structure and theme to, what scares us, it just opens up a lot of possibilities. And I think the ability, if you can make an audience feel like they're not safe, with the atmosphere, that then you've got them. And so there's so many distractions these days, but when you're watching a horror movie, if you lock in, you're fine. You're in your living room. You're totally safe. You're in a movie theater. There's other people around, but it can cast a spell that can really make you sort of, submit to the narrative in a way that other genres can't, perhaps, because of, that sense of I don't feel like I'm safe, even though everything around me tells me that I am, but the story is telling me that I'm not.
Yeah. Uh, with story being at heart here, I'm curious what you would want to share about Ferocious as far as what readers can expect and maybe some of the spark behind the project.
Sure. Yeah, it's really born out of my love of, samurai movies and Hong Kong martial arts films, and the way that those narrative structures worked. And you sort of look at this kind of romantic notion with the swordplay movies, with the samurai movie, particularly like the first Zatoichi. But this thing you see it in martial arts movies a lot too, of like trying to find the opponent that's actually a worthy opponent. And it becomes
Mhm.
almost this like romantic, not sexual, but a romantic notion of like, who's that one person out there who's the one for you that can maybe defeat you or can maybe provide that challenge. And you combine that with some of the other tropes that you see sometimes with, there's always a master and an apprentice sort of narrative, or a revenge narrative. And this is sort of my way of like just taking my love of all of those types of tropes and that structure, and like, what if they were all kind of the same thing? Is there a way to kind of tell a character-based story that takes from all of those, fruit from all of those trees, and then just wraps it up in a thing that looks and feels a little bit more like European fantasy, the classic, almost a little bit of a Dungeons and Dragons sort of element, but with this soul of more of a samurai film, and that sort of alchemy. I love to mix genres and play with that, and so that was a lot of the seed of the desire, was to tell that kind of story in maybe a different type of container.
It's nice. Yeah. Uh, with comics, you have an artist that you're working with. We've kind of talked a little bit about that collaboration,
Yeah.
but I'm curious as the writer what it was like to kind of describe these scenes and to describe the story and then to get that back visually.
Really rewarding and really fun. Movies, it takes, about 5 years from the time I'm writing something to when I finally get to
Wow. Yeah.
see something. Not always, but for the most part, it's a pretty long process, and this is much faster with comics. But also just fun to, see the character designs coming in and getting to collaborate on that, even down to things like, you know, as a screenwriter, you don't get involved in production design so much, but here we got to weigh in and sort of, the artist and I are creating a specific iconic weapon for the character, and we're
Mhm.
having to sort of talk about every little piece of armor, and is there a backstory to that, and like stuff that we know that maybe we'll reveal to the readers and maybe not. And so getting into all of that texture and being able to participate in that was super rewarding and super exciting. And it's just, it's just a medium I love. So it's just cool to be able to see like, oh, there it is, for the first time. And I hear from other people that never really goes away. Christmas morning, is the day that you get the pages back and you get to see it, come to life.
Yeah. What is next for you? I'm hoping more comics. I'm hoping more of those things.
Me too. I would love to do more comics. Emanuele Ergolani and I are already talking a little bit about like, well, we got to do this again. Like now that this is coming out,
Yeah,
like what else can we do? So we're jamming on some stuff, and hopefully we can find a home for that. Always working on more movies. You always have to have irons in the fire. So there are definitely things that I can't talk about that are very exciting and, is really a favorite property of mine that I'm getting to sort of work on a remake of, which is cool, but can't say too much, but got a lot of those projects going. Had a movie just come out called She Rides Shotgun, starring Taron Egerton, that's now on VOD. That is sort of worth checking out and really propulsive
hmm.
and fun. Cool movie and yeah, and then of course Ferocious coming out in November. So
Sharing across media. I love it. Anywhere that people can find out more about your work, online, conventions, any of those kind of spaces that you'd like to mention.
I mean, hopefully I'll be able to do some conventions and signings, with Mad Cave to promote Ferocious, but I don't do a ton of social media just for my own mental health and spirituality. But I am on Instagram as like kind of the one place that I am, and it's piotrowski.luke at Instagram, and I'm not super active on there, but that's the place where I'll be sort of promoting things and talking about stuff that's coming out, or maybe just posting panels of comics that I think are interesting, or weird Hong Kong movies that I'm watching. But that's pretty much it.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Well, I don't blame you for having boundaries around social media. It is its own kind of horror, and I much prefer the horror that you're creating in comics and film.
Thanks so much for taking the time to
Of
talk
course,
to me and get the word out about this book. It's like, again, like I said, it's my first comic, so I'm not necessarily a known commodity in that world, but hopefully we can get some eyes on it and people like it enough for us to be able to do some more somewhere down the line.